Okay, in part two, I want to discuss white collar crime. And I have to admit, as I was telling one of the students last night, normally when I teach this class on campus, this is my week when I show. Uh, I don't lecture, and I show the film. I show the Enron. I show the Enron film. Smartest guys in the room. Really good film. Demonstrates a lot of the very good tool for building discussion um, for white collar crime. And actually had considered making it a part of this course, but I couldn't require everyone to have a Netflix account or go out and rent a copy of the movie. It's also based on a really good book about Enron. If you get an opportunity, you might watch the film. I think it is available on Netflix on instant streaming, um, or you might read the book. Um, let's see, white collar crime. Understand that the study of white collar crime is less common than other types of crime. Historically, criminologists focused on street crime, violent crime, murder, homicide, sexual assault, things like that. And for a long time, the crimes committed by corporations and and crimes that are committed in the context of the business world were not studied by criminologists. But it is a worthwhile thing to study because it's a unique and different type of crime. And certainly, it's something that's been with us historically longer than you want to think. Consider wealthy railroad tycoons of the past. Certainly engaged both in crime and questionable business practices to achieve their fortunes. Factories during the industrial age churned out their products under inhumane working conditions and very low wages. Um, we've had, as early as the 1900s, muckrakers criticized businesses and political corruption, condemned the treatment of workers. But it really wasn't until Edwin Sutherland, the same theorist who gives us our ideas about differential association. Wasn't until Edwin Sutherland in the 1940s began to study this phenomenon. In fact, he was the theorist that came up with the moniker white collar crime. In the 1940s, Edwin Sutherland studied the 70 largest U.S. manufacturing, mining, retail corporations, finding numerous law violations. And this corporate crime, questioned our assumptions about crime being directly related to poverty. In fact, it is this revelation was part of his thinking with the development of differential association. Let's see. How do I define white collar crime as crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. Some researchers come up with other terms. Really Sutherland's term was best, but you might find it called elite deviance, respectable crime. Respectable crime. I thought that was the wise guys. Upper world crime. Clinard and Quinney give us a definition, kind of two types of white collar crime. One being occupational crime, which is crime committed by an individual in the course of their occupation for personal gain, and then corporate crimes, which are crimes committed by a corporation for financial gain. We talk about occupational crime. Again, that's law breaking for personal gain. Examples include employee theft, pilferage, embezzlement. About 3/4 of all workers are thought to steal in some way from their employers. Taking toilet paper home from work, stealing office supplies. That is type of employee. It's a type of occupational crime, even though many of us don't think of it that way. There's pilferage. So I use the two terms, pilferage and embezzlement. Pilferage is the theft of merchandise or tools. Common reasons for pilferage include dissatisfaction with pay, dissatisfaction with working conditions, poor treatment by managers. They don't pay me good enough, so I take a case of toilet paper home with me once a month. In most places I've worked, who'd want to do that? Because in most places I've worked, they stock that really horrible one-ply paper, toilet paper. That's the reason you usually wait till you try as hard as you can not to have to use the bathroom at work. People do it anyway. I mean, your workplace might stock the cheapest, most horrible writing pens in the world, but there's always going to be that one or two people that take a box of pens home with them to supplement their paycheck. Another possible explanation could be workplace culture. There are some places where the culture just facilitates. Everybody does it. In your orientation walk through the building, here's the supply room. This is where we take our supplies. This is where we get our pens and papers to do our homework with. The other type of occupational crime that I mentioned was embezzlement. This is the theft of cash and the misuse of funds. Think about the collective embezzlement in the savings and loan industry, where you had individuals stealing company funds by basically top executives, stealing the funds, stealing company funds, or the use of complicated schemes to siphon funds. One way you might look at this, one thing you might look at along these lines, professional fraud. Look at professional fraud in the healthcare market, where you have an estimated annual cost of about $100 billion. This involves things like unnecessary surgery for the insurance money, financial fraud, like insider trading, where a person has knowledge of a company's economic fortune, buys and sells stock before the info is shared with the public. Why do I have that in my notes next to healthcare fraud? I don't know. You might have within occupational crime a corruption element where corporations are or individuals are corrupting individuals are corrupting public officials. Then let's see. We'll talked about occupational crime, but organizational or corporate crime. Corporate financial crime includes corporate fraud, cheating, and corruption. Again, Enron, WorldCom, Halliburton, Rite Aid are all examples of companies that have fallen as a result of corporate financial crime. These are companies involved in things like price fixing and price gouging, restraint of trade, false advertising, and really encourage, if you really want to see in-depth detail of these crimes, read or watch the Enron Smartest Guys in the Room. These people did some horrible things. For example, out in California, what the company was doing was they, through their connection with Governor Schwarzenegger, and even before that, when the governor before him, Enron convinced people of California to deregulate their energy market, and then helped them write their energy codes. And then managed to start taking advantage. The state of California, I don't know how many of you remember, years ago, the state of California was going through rolling blackouts, even during the hottest part of their summers. People were dying, older folks were dying in their homes, so they didn't have electricity. They couldn't afford the air conditioning. You had folks who could not pay their electric bill because the electricity prices were through the roof. And the reality of the time was California was making more than enough power to meet the needs of its citizens, except that Enron was trading that power like a commodity and shipping it out of California. They were doing things like creating artificial blackouts to raise demand, so they had an excuse to raise prices. Um, they would create artificial shortages by moving the energy out of California and then making people pay exorbitant prices to get the energy back, get their own energy back into California. It was a horrible situation. But Enron made millions and millions and millions of dollars doing it. And it was all through the manipulation of the law. You also can, in this environment, you can come up with what we call corporate violence. Usually this involves threats to health and safety, where you have workers being subjected to unsafe working conditions, things like perhaps through exposure to toxic substances. You're probably looking at about 5,700 deaths each year to unsafe business practices. This could be things like farmers being exposed to dangerous pesticides, mining companies not meeting safety standards, that sort of thing. Of course, when we deal with corporate crime in this area and just the general public, not their own workers, then you're talking about the production of unsafe practices, like the defective gas tank in the Ford Pintos in the 1970s, where you had a vehicle where if it was in a rear-ended collision, it stood a fairly decent chance of exploding. Not a well-made car, the Ford Pinto. Cheap, though. We had things in the automobile industry with companies that saved a buck, saved some dollars putting tires that weren't safe for the vehicles they were on. Engine malfunctions, through the intentional use of substandard parts. Not to pick on the automobile industry, but you also see, where you have the pharmaceutical industry knowingly marketing dangerous drugs. Where we have the food industry distributing contaminated food. Or you have, and again, talking more about public health risk, you could have some corporate crime in dealing with corporations that knowingly and willingly violate Environmental Protection Agency regulations, creating pollution hazards. And the reality is, with pollution, much of the pollution that is occurring is preventable, but it's regulated by some really weak laws. While there is federal monitoring, it's not very stringent, and the penalties for violations of EPA standards can be fairly minimal. And most companies, if a company can make more money, can pay the fines, and still make a sizable profit, then they will. But the consequences for the public, are cancer, and illness, and death, particularly through the dumping of toxic waste. Overall, what are the costs? And a lot of times I talk about white-collar crime in my classes because, for quote-unquote regular crime, victims, there can be a lot of victims for a crime. Usually there are more victims for crime than people recognize. But with white-collar crime, the number of victims can become astronomical. Astronomical. Consider the worst serial killer in history. And even that person does not have, cannot even come close to approaching the number of victims, say, the Enron Corporation had. When all fell apart for Enron, its victims numbered in the thousands and thousands and thousands. We're talking several thousand employees, not just out of a job, but having lost their entire pension fund. Because as Enron was collapsing, the CEOs, the ringleaders of that particular company, froze trading on the stocks, refused to allow their employees to cash out their pension funds. At the same time, they were cashing out their stocks, and so they drained out all the pension funds. They got all the money, and then by the time all the chips fell, every time it was done, there was no money left over. In the movie I keep mentioning, there's a scene about this guy working for Florida Light and Power, one of these small energy companies that had been a part of Enron or been bought up by Enron at one point. And he said, at Enron's height, his retirement plan, which was mostly Enron stock, which is what Enron encouraged its employees to do. At the height of Enron's power, his pension he was going to live high on the hog when he retired. It had tons of money in it. And the guy said after Enron fell, after the company got done stealing all their money, he had nothing. It was going to be he wouldn't be able to retire. He had next to nothing left in his pension fund. Excuse me. So when we talk about the economic and human cost of white-collar crime, keep in mind that corporate crime causes more damage and tends to hurt more people than any other type of individual crime. Consider on an annual basis the cost for property, street-type crime, $17 billion. I mean, billion with a B. That's still it's a whole lot of money. It's a whole lot of zeros. Annual cost of white-collar crime, about $800 billion. Huge difference. And that's just That's not that's not just counting numbers of victims. Our estimates, government interest estimates, state that there are more deaths caused by white-collar crime than homicide every year. How would we explain it? It has some similarities with regular crime, in that white-collar crime involves theft. It often involves some sort of violence. Both white-collar criminals and traditional criminals break the law when there's opportunity and motive present. And both types of criminals use techniques of neutralization to justify their behavior. White-collar crime is different because with street crime you can argue predisposition through biological, psychological abnormalities. There are other things to explain. But you can't blame white-collar crime on biological predisposition towards crime. You can't explain white-collar crime by saying those people that were victimized by it were the victims of social disorganization. Really, Sutherland's differential association is one of the very few theories that can attempt to explain white-collar crime. And the other thing about white-collar crime is it's perceived differently. There are cultural biases for white-collar crime. We live in a society today where, as the character from the Wall Street movie said, greed is good. White-collar crime is not as harshly punished. It's fairly lenient. The corporations, again, they're subject to weak or absent regulations. There is quite a bit of difficulty in proving corporate crime. It's fairly rare when these people are called for it's fairly rare when the Bernie Madoffs and the Jeff Skillings of the world are held accountable. Because they're fairly difficult to crime. I mean, these guys, the people that do these things they're not your dumb street criminal that gets caught and goes to prison. These, your Bernie Madoffs, your Jeff Skillings, um, your Andy Fastow type people. They're brilliant. They're very, very intelligent people, and it's very hard to catch them. When we do catch them, we don't punish them very severely. Incarceration doesn't have that much of an impact on corporate criminals, and it's hard to do something about it because there's not a lot of media attention. Unless it's a Bernie Madoff or an Enron, these things don't come to light very often. It's just our news media's got that if it bleeds, it leads mentality, and corporate crime just isn't exciting enough. Isn't exciting enough to sell advertising time on your newspaper show, on your news show, or on your new magazine. How might you reduce white collar crime? Well, regulatory agencies need better budgets. The media needs to focus on it a little more. Usually, when something is done, consider government response to sex offenders. The Megan's laws and sex offender registration, and all that really is. All those things really are were helped along by the media, and so we need that kind of attention towards white collar crime. We need some suggest that punishments need to be more severe. The side benefit, I suppose, to the fact that there really aren't any biological or psychological predispositions to explain white collar crime, is that classical criminology concepts ought to work with these people. If we can come up with a swift, certain, and severe punishment, and a punishment that can get their attention, we've got a pretty good chance of impacting white collar crime. And, I think that's enough for white collar crime. Let's see, what do we want to talk about next? About white collar crime. Let's end this, and then we'll talk about consensual crime. And that could be a fairly long video. I don't know yet. I have no idea how long these things are going to be done until I start them. So let's call this good for part 2, and then we'll do a part 3 for public order crime, in other places known as consensual or victimless crime.